Alright, the scene I have set up in Unity uses the Cinity Studios simple military asset. Uh, you don't need to buy the asset to follow along, but what I have set up is a little player character who has an animator attached and a script that I already wrote that will play some weapon effects, and we'll call upon this a little later on. Obviously, you can do this in your own game with your own assets to follow along. Now, the first thing we need to do is create our fire weapon scripts. So I will go create C# script, and I'll go fire weapon. Okay. And I will open that up in Visual Studio. All right, now that I have my weapon script open, there's a few things I'm going to need. The first is a reference to the effects script that I wrote earlier. So I will call private weapon effects, and I will just call it effects. The other thing I want to define is how quickly can the player fire the gun. So I'm going to create a float, private float, and we'll call it fire rate. Now I'm going to want to edit that in the inspector. So I'm going to use the serialized field tag so I can play around with this later. And today I want to show you two different ways that you can call a coroutine. And so one of those ways will require a reference to that coroutine. So I will define a private enumerator, not enumerable, but enumerator. And I will call it fire coroutine. And I'll come back to that a little later on. Now, of course, my weapon effects script needs to be instantiated, so I will come into the start method, and I will go effects equals get component of type weapon effects. All right, and so we'll call that when we're actually firing. All right, so on to the coroutine. So in order to write a coroutine is in the type enumerator. So I will go private enumerator, and I will call it fire gun. And I won't take any variables at this stage. And I will open that up. Now it's going to give me an error, and it's saying not all code paths return a value, and that's because it's expecting a return type. So what we will do first is I'll create a while loop. I'll go while true, and I'm going to leave it as true. And what I will return is, so I will first yield. So you need to yield in the coroutine, and we'll go return new wait for end of frame. And we'll close that out. So let's have a little think about what's happening here. So when the coroutine starts to run, it will start this while loop, but because it's set to true, it's going to keep going indefinitely. But when it gets to the end of the while loop here, it's going to wait until the end of the frame. So essentially what I've done is recreated the update method. So whatever happens in this while loop will get called every frame. And the reason I want to do this is because I want to constantly check if the player is pressing the shoot button. So let's do that, shall we? So we'll create another while loop, and we'll go while, and this time we'll get an input from the player. So we'll go input.getKey. Of course, you can change this depending on your own control setup. And just for this demo, I will use the spacebar to fire. And so now, every frame, it will check if the player is holding down the spacebar. And if the player is holding down the spacebar, it's going to perform whatever logic is in this while loop. Okay, so let's write that, shall we? So when the player hits the spacebar, they're shooting, and the first thing I want to do is call on the weapon effects script from earlier. So effects dot and I forgot to think about what I called it. So animation, shoot animation. So what that method will do is just play a little animation, and we will also play a little bit of a gun flare as well. So add a little bit of spark at the end of the gun barrel. Again, you don't really need to worry about how that's working for this demonstration. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to check if the player actually shot anything. So to do that, I'm going to perform a raycast. And to do the raycast, I need to define a raycast hit. So raycast hit, and we will call that hit. And we will do a check to see if we hit anything. So we will go if physics.raycast, and we will pass in, so the raycast will start from the player's position. So we will go transform, lowercase t, transform.position, and we will continue it just forward. So we just will go vector3.forward. So whatever way the player is facing. Oh, actually, sorry, we'll go, not vector3, we'll go transform.forward. So the forward direction of the player. And then if we hit anything, I want to save that out into our it. So we'll go out hit. Now, if you've never seen raycast before, you don't have to worry about this necessarily. The point is the coroutine. But if hit.collider, and let's just check if it's tagged as an enemy. And if it's tagged as enemy, then we will damage enemy. All right, and you can perform your own logic there. All right, so but then what we want to do is we don't want this to happen every single frame. We want to wait a little bit of time before the player can shoot again, even if they're holding down the spacebar. And so we will once again yield. All right, and we will go return new, and we're going to this time wait for seconds. So we're going to wait for a period of time, and that time is our fire rate. So our fire rate will be the time between shots if the player is still holding down the spacebar. Now, if they let go of the spacebar, then this while loop will break out, and then we will return to once again checking every frame if the player has hit the space. All right, and that's our coroutine written. So in essence, that will fire the weapon. Now all we need to do is call upon this, and because I'm checking every frame, I can call this in start only once. So I can go start coroutine, and I will pass in the string name of the coroutine, in which case it's fire gun. And that's it. So let's jump up into Unity, and we will click on our player, and we'll add component, and we'll add fire weapon. And let's just set the fire rate to 1 second, just for testing purposes. And if all goes well, then this worked. So let's hit play. And if I hit the space bar, you can see that it is firing the weapon. And if I hit it really fast, it doesn't change anything. It's still going to wait that 1 second. So if I can change that to 5. And if I hold down the space bar, you can see it's waiting 5 seconds and then firing again. And that's the beauty of it. So you can define the fire rate for different weapons. But before we wrap up here, what I want to show is just a slightly different way that you could call a coroutine and to achieve the same thing. So let's suppose for a moment that I wanted to call this from a different script. That's quite possible. So, I could make this public. So now that it's public, another script could potentially call this, and maybe I don't want to define the fire rate in this script, but I want to pass it in. And so what I could do is define in the method float fire rate. All right, and so now it will wait for the fire rate that is initially defined when this is called. And so I could get rid of this serialized field up here. But there's a problem in that this start coroutine here takes a string value. There's no way for me to set the value of the fire rate in this method. So even if I just go fire rate, fire gun, and I go 0. 1 second. Let's say I did that, and I jump back into Unity. You'll see I'll get an error, and it will not wait 1 second. And so you can see coroutine fire gun could not be started. All right, so what do you do? So what do we do? Well, we'll jump back over into our script, and we will delete the start row coroutine. And what I'll do instead is I'll rely on this fire coroutine I started up here. And I will go first check that it's not already in use. So I will go if fire coroutine does not equal null. So if we haven't set it to anything, it will by default be null. So if it's not equal to null, sorry, actually we want it equal to null. So if it's null, as in not in use, what we will do is assign, we'll say fire coroutine is equal to fire gun, and this time we can pass in the fire rate of, let's say, 1 second. And then what we can do is start coroutine, and we will call fire coroutine. So that's how you could call a coroutine that has that takes input. And so if I jump back over into Unity and I hit play, you can see now I'm back to firing at a 1 second fire rate. So those are the two ways you could use coroutines. You could call it and define your variables in it, or if you take an input type, then you could simply save it as a variable in the script. And of course, I could always stop this coroutine and set it back equal to null and recall it again and change the variable, which I'll cover in a future video. But for now, that's how you fire a gun using coroutines. Thanks for watching.